people started saying that the pandemic had made ageism worse. I don't think that's true. I think the pandemic exposed the ageism that has been all around us all along and has given us a historic opportunity to build on that awareness. I would make an analogy to the Black Lives Matter movement here in the United States, forcing people to look at systemic racism, the way it is embedded in the culture and the consequences for people of color. I would say the pandemic has catalyzed a similar shift. It has brought age and aging out of the shadows into the middle of the room and provoked a lot of necessary and long-awaited conversations. It has made me aware of the need of the way the pandemic exposed the way all different forms of oppression and vulnerabilities are interconnected, and that we really need to address all of them if we are to have a world of age equity or racial equity. For my own personal work, where I have done the most work was provoked by the way the pandemic was initially framed. And this was from the director of the World Health Organization, who commented on this, that originally it was around the world, don't worry, it's just going to affect old people and sick people. And sick is a proxy, a placeholder for disabled. And that is one reason why around the world, so many countries and governments were so slow to respond. Of course, we learned that it also affected younger people. And of course, when older people die, it also affects younger people. But what we are looking at now is the global quantifiable cost of ageism and ableism, which is prejudice against people with disabilities, by valuing those lives less. So in my own work, I have begun to address much more explicitly how much of our fear of aging is rooted in fear of our bodies and our brains working less well, how that makes dual stigma. I may be old, but at least I'm not disabled. I may be disabled, but at least I'm not old. When we think that way, we just make the stigma worse, and we lose the opportunity to join forces and look at what's really going on and try and reduce stigma around both disability and aging, which is necessary if we want a more equitable world. I would say my answer would overlap with that last one. I think that, I don't mean to cast the pandemic in a positive light because the death toll is so hideous. So many of those deaths were preventable, especially in the United States, and because the toll has fallen so disproportionately hard on Black and brown and indigenous and disabled people. So not to excuse that, but I think it has woken people up to the way all these communities and all these issues are interconnected. And I think I know it has brought a lot of people. I read that in the United States, for the first time since the Great Depression, more younger people are living with their families than since the Depression. Like everything, there's two sides to that. That does increase the risk of contagion, of the virus. But, and sometimes, of course, it is not by choice, it is by economic necessity. But I think having the generations in greater contact is a good thing. I think we have learned a lot about social isolation. And of course, these are not problems that just affect older people. There are studies in the United States that show that it is people in their 20s and 30s that experience the most loneliness. So I think we are beginning to think more imaginatively and with more empathy about how to bridge those gaps. I see that more people, and again, we are talking about the privileged, the people who have access to the internet and access to devices. So it is incumbent on everyone to close that digital divide, because it is another way the burden of the pandemic falls most heavily on people without resources and people without homes. Within that, we have found lots of new ways to get. Geography has become less relevant. That's kind of amazing, right? And one more point. And I think that the opportunity to connect in that way especially, it's another interesting point about disability. People with disabilities have been asking for decades to be able to work from home. Once the health of the general public was at risk, those accommodations magically became accessible. This is an example of the way that those of us who are not disabled, or maybe not so disabled, can pressure employers to make those changes permanent, so that meetings and groups and workplaces and economic opportunities are accessible to more people. That's an example of how we can show solidarity. I know that prediction, only fools make predictions that can be disproven. I also know that they are really tempting. I think we don't know. The economic and social cost of the pandemic has been unthinkably huge, but I do think that the general public and political leaders, if they have the will, have a new vantage point to see that there is enormous potential in this moment for profound social and economic change to address inequality, which we know is bad for the economy. We know it makes people angry. We see that it provokes political uprising. So I think it can go either way, especially in the US. We can buckle down and just try and get things back to normal. But one of the helpful lessons for me from the pandemic, especially because of doing a little more work around racism, is that normal is what brought us to the pandemic. Normal is what brought us. It was never, first of all, there's no such thing as normal. That whole idea is heteronormative, sexist, ageist, and all the rest. But normal was not good for the vast majority of humanity. So I'm hoping that instead of sort of fetishizing this idea of everything getting back to how it was, it can't. We don't want that. We want a more egalitarian future. Here's an interesting thing about that, a timely point. The World Health Organization, working with two different United Nations agencies, is launching on March 18th a global conversation around ageism, and their global report on ageism, which I was lucky enough to read as a peer reviewer, because they understand, it's in conjunction with the decade of healthy aging. They understand that ageism is the biggest public health threat in the world. This is not the World Old People Organization. This is the World Health Organization. And that confronting ageism, building awareness, learning what it is, learning to talk about it, learning to understand old age more broadly and more accurately is the single most important thing people around the world can do to have a more healthy and better later half of their lives. That's really exciting. When we have stopped the climate from heating up, I think if there is one, you never want to pick an issue. You never want to say one form of discrimination is more important or more bad than another because of the way they're all interlocked. If we don't have a planet to live on, all this becomes academic. And of course, again, the effects of climate change are affecting, as we see in Texas with this cold snap. And who is it hurting the most? The the most economically disadvantaged people there. So once we have put a handle on the climate crisis, then things will settle down. The most important, it's not a professional field, but I think the most important activism is going to come from the sphere of social justice, because that is where the big picture is about how economic and social developments affect people of different socioeconomic status, different colors, different genders. It's a huge gender equity issue. Look at the effect of the pandemic on women of color, who, in the United States, people say women have lost more jobs. That's true, but white women have actually benefited. And it's women of color and immigrants and people without papers, women who have suffered the most. So I hope that pressure will come from all the groups that address these forms of inequity to push for developments in business and in technology that advance, that lift all the boats. Oh, gee, if you had told me 15 years ago that I would be fascinated by aging, I would have said, why do I want to think about something sad and depressing and icky? And aging is how we move through life, right? It's not just something annoying old people do. And this is new. This longevity is a new biological and social and economic phenomenon. We have a historic opportunity to tap into the social capital of millions more healthy, well-educated adults than ever before in human history. That's incredible. And yes, ageism is a huge obstacle. Aging is not the problem. Discrimination on the basis of age is the obstacle, but it's not all ageism. This longevity has happened in the blink of an eye in evolutionary terms, and roles and rituals have yet to evolve to make the most of this new longevity. So we have a historic and really exciting opportunity, and it just gets more interesting all the time. I know I smile when I talk about it because it's interesting and it's so unexamined. Just a thought to leave you with, that in the Paleolithic era, I think we were hominids then, but our prehistoric ancestors of human beings evolved into living long enough to have a third generation. It's called the grandmother hypothesis, that the evolution of a third living generation enabled humanity to flourish as never before. That is when art happened. That is when music happened. In our lifespan, the lifespan of each of us, for the first time in human history, 4 and even 5 living generations are becoming possible. So extrapolate outward. There are real challenges. I am not saying that an aging population will require all kinds of support that we need to figure out. But we also have this opportunity that is not just unprecedented in sort of modern history, but in human evolutionary history. And that's pretty exciting.